Welcome everybody to Chicago Autism Network's virtual parent workshops. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Rachel Loftin present to us. Dr. Loftin is a clinical and school psychologist in private practice and adjunct faculty in the Psychiatry Department at Yale School of Medicine. She specializes in the treatment of people with autism throughout the lifespan. She is on the board of directors for several local autism organizations, including Chicago Autism Network, and we are so grateful to have her here with us. So I will turn the time over to Rachel.
Thanks, Kimmy. I'm excited to be able to talk to everyone today about intimate relationships and sexuality as it relates to autism. I always like to start this talk by explaining how I got into this particular area, because when I first became interested in autism, giving a sex ed talk wasn't something I ever did or expected to do. But over time, I started to have patients who would get in trouble. And often it was because they just hadn't been taught the right behaviors to either start a dating relationship or, to disclose what they wanted from someone or just to openly talk about sexuality. And sometimes too, there were problem behaviors that I was asked to help with, like public masturbation or removing clothes and that kind of thing. And so even though I never set out to be interested in sex ed or to study it in any way, because of both my patient population and then eventually even being asked to help on criminal cases where someone with autism was accused of doing something of a sexual nature that's illegal. It just became a side gig. So that's how I got to this point and why I talk about this stuff. But I do want to point out that a whole lot of what I talk about today is not specific to autism. So most of what I talk about is just good teaching. And as long as you're individualizing for the learner and you're thinking about your learner's needs, good teaching is good teaching. So just something to keep in mind if you're going to be working with somebody who doesn't have autism, maybe you're an autistic adult who has a neurotypical kid, all of this stuff will still apply. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide here, the second slide. And then the point of the slide is, why am I even taking the time to do this? And there are a few reasons. For sure, there's a substantially higher risk of abuse, and in particular sexual assault, in the neurodevelopmentally disabled population. So if somebody is neurodevelopmentally diverse, they have a much higher risk of abuse. Whether or not there's a higher risk of perpetration is a question. It doesn't seem, and nobody really seems to think that autistic people are predators or anything like that. However, if you're not teaching people how to start relationships and how to interact with people, there's a real risk of autistic people accidentally breaking some of the social rules that we have. So for instance, we'll talk a little bit later about stalking. If you've never taught an autistic young man how to approach someone he's interested in dating, how often he can text someone he's interested in dating, it's pretty easy to cross that line into stalking, sending too many texts, being too pushy, and we'll talk about that later. So that's what I mean by counterfeit versus true deviance. Someone who is breaking rules just because they've never been taught is quite different from someone who knows that what they're doing is wrong and continues to do it. All of that aside, I think the real risk of not having good sex education, not having good education about how to form intimate and meaningful relationships is the loss of quality of life. And as we'll talk about in a minute, most autistic people want to have a partner. And if you want to have a partner and you don't, that can be a very painful thing. So there's a real quality of life risk if people aren't taught the information that they need. Okay, and then on the third slide, is a separate autism talk necessary? So is what people with autism need really different from what the general population needs? As I already talked about, for a lot of the education, probably not. You still need to think about a learner's individual needs, break things down, give people information in a way that they can take it in and make sense of it. So a lot of those concerns are going to be the same. For the most part, autistic people are living in the same world as neurotypical people, so a lot of the same concerns are going to come up. However, sometimes there are pretty specific differences in perhaps the level of social instruction somebody needs, how much you have to break something down to explain the social norms of a situation. And that can be, of course, a much bigger need in autism. But also sometimes behaviorally, then things come up. And we'll talk about that a bit more as we go through. So I think a separate autism talk is necessary. And I hope it'll be helpful for people. Relatedly, on the fourth slide, I want us to start to think about, well, is sexuality different for people with autism? What we know for the most part is maturation isn't that different. So there may be some slight differences in how bodies mature, how adolescence, puberty kind of comes about, but nothing too significant. But sexuality, is that different? Is gender different? We really don't know. There's a lot of research coming out, but it's still a bit mixed. So we'll go through a little of that here. Some emerging research suggests that there might be differences in the sexual behavior of people who are autistic, and there might be differences in identification. So identification is what you call yourself: gay, straight, bi, pan, whatever the lingo is, that's identification. I'll talk more about that in a second. One consistent finding in research, though, is that most autistic people desire relationships, and yet still relatively few attain them. The good news is, as time goes on and newer studies come out, they're reporting more and more people who want relationships as finding them, but it's still a lower percentage than it is in neurotypical populations, and it's still, everybody isn't finding the relationship they want. Now, on the next slide, regarding that question of sexual behavior and is that different in autism, sexual behavior is what you actually do, as opposed to identification, which is what you call yourself. So a man who has sex with another man, that's just behavior. If he calls himself gay, that's identification, just to clarify what those terms mean. For a long time in the research literature, autistic people were thought to have higher rates of sexuality. Over time, we're finding that that's not necessarily the case. There are a lot of reasons that the older studies found that. And one reason I think a lot of the parents on the call might appreciate is a lot of the old studies were conducted simply by interviewing parents. And so parents were asked, is your kid interested in sex? Has your kid had sex? Those kinds of questions. And what we know is once your kid's an adult, you probably don't have a clue whether they want to have sex or not, or whether they have had sex or not. So there were problems, a lot of methodological problems with those early studies. There is some clinical indication that there might be more atypical sexual behavior in autism, so fetishes and things like that. However, most researchers are starting to think that that might not be the case. Really, what might be the case is that autistic people may just be more open and willing to talk about those things. They may be less constrained by the social norms, which would limit other people from speaking more openly about those things. The next slide deals more specifically with gender identity and sexual orientation. So this is another area where the research is just emerging. We're starting to see some evidence that trans identity or non-binary gender identity rates might be higher in autism. Again, is that something genetic? Is it, the etiology of that isn't too clear. Is it just that autistic people are less constrained by social norms and therefore more comfortable coming out about their gender? Not really clear yet. It'll be an interesting thing to monitor over time as we start to learn more. And that's also true for, questionably, it could be true for gay, lesbian, bi, pan identities. What we do know is mostly the recent studies have tended to find that lesbian and bi and pan identities are higher in autistic women than in neurotypical women. But that's less true, seems to be less true with men, although again, these studies are just emerging. So there's not a lot of solid science on this yet. So all of that is just to talk a little about, is anything different about sexuality and autism? And the answer really is, it's emerging. It seems like things could be a little different, but maybe that comes down simply to the fact that autistic people tend to be less constrained by social norms. Is there some kind of innate difference as well? And I don't think we really know that yet about sexuality and relationships. On the next slide, what we do know is that some of the features of autism can pose barriers to relationships. The first one I think is perhaps the most obvious, but if you have difficulties with social communication, and that's a defining feature of autism. So if you have difficulties with social communication, it can make it hard to start relationships. Especially romantic relationships and intimate relationships require pretty high degree of social communication. So any impairment there can make it harder to form relationships. Likewise, it takes a lot of social knowledge and understanding of social norms to start dating and to have intimate relationships. And if a person who's autistic has not been explicitly taught that information or hasn't figured it out for him or herself, then they might not have the information they need to know how to appropriately go about forming an intimate relationship. For some, an insistence on sameness, so needing to do the same things the same way. If, for instance, you always need to be home at 5 o'clock to watch a certain show and you need to eat the same frozen dinner, that could get in the way of having a date night. That could get in the way of trying something new or having an experience that dating would involve. Likewise, sensory experiences. For this one, I like to pick on my neurotypical husband. He's not autistic, but he does have a sensory sensitivity. He's very sensitive to mouth noises. So if anyone's chewing or just moving their mouth around or chomping gum or something, it makes him absolutely nuts. And that's similar to the way that an autistic person might experience some sensory stimuli. If you're extremely sensitive to touch, for example, that could make being intimate very difficult. I've certainly heard people tell me that kissing and the wetness of it is repulsive from a sensory standpoint. So certainly that can get in the way of an intimate relationship. For other people, they may not have the social motivation. They might be interested in dating. They might wish they had a partner, but they don't have enough motivation to be out there and be social to kind of push them over the hump to get there. And that kind of goes along with interest. You could want to be dating if you don't have enough interest in pursuing a person, if they're not interesting enough and engaging enough. It might be simpler and easier to stay home and to do the things you're comfortable with and the things that you enjoy. You have to feel compelled to go out and try to date. Secondary traits, anxiety is extremely common in autism. And for a person who experiences a lot of social anxiety, dating can be absolutely horrific. It might be something that people, even if they really want a partner, are not willing to face in order to get that partner. For a lot of autistic people, chronological age, so their actual age, might be a lot higher than where they function socially. So for example, a 20-year-old man who's interested in a children's cartoon and is interested in other childish things is going to have difficulty connecting with age-appropriate partners, by which I mean people over 18, right? And so that sometimes that mismatch between chronological age and social functioning, which is common in autism, can really get in the way of relationships. Also, sometimes I hear a lot of adults tell me that they want to date, but they can't date until they're done with college, they've started their career, and then it's time to date. So really there's a focus intensely on one thing at a time. So sometimes people will want a relationship and they're planning to have a relationship, but they need to get through the sequence of focusing on one thing at a time before they can get there. The The next slide. So we talked about what are the potential barriers an autistic person might face within themselves, but what about within a family? A lot of times there are family factors that can really get in the way of good sex education, good comprehensive sex education. Sometimes there's something about the family culture. The family may have beliefs that are different from what the autistic person believes. They may have very poor modeling. So in some families, there's domestic violence or otherwise, mistreating or poorly interacting with people. I've had legal cases in which the father was extremely promiscuous and then put a lot of pressure on his son to be sexually active. So there's poor modeling there because those were unhealthy relationships, and the father was trying to model it and push his son that way. And sometimes the family just simply has a lack of knowledge about the issues that their child is facing. For example, a cis heterosexual couple who are parents to a trans pansexual child might not have the information that they need to support their child. So there may be some sex education that's needed even for parents, not just for the autistic person. Sometimes parents have an embarrassment or an unwillingness. I see this a lot in families I do therapy with. And there I end up spending a lot of time just normalizing talking about sex. Honestly, it was hard for me too at first. When I first started to give these kinds of talks, I wasn't used to using a lot of these terms and talking about these things openly. So sometimes it's simply a matter of practicing and getting used to it and getting more comfortable with some of the language and some of the topics. Also, a lot of parents are tired. They have to worry about academics. They have to worry about after school stuff and therapies and this and that. And sometimes they're too tired to get around to the sex ed part, even if they think of it, which they might not with all these other things to think about. It can be hard with everything else that they're managing. And then the last point, when you have tired caregivers, kids often aren't getting the level of supervision that they need online. And as we go forward, you're going to hear me talk a lot about the need for online supervision and some of the difficulties with kids being online unsupervised. Because what we found over time is that the internet really becomes the source for sex education for a lot of kids. And of course, that's problematic for a lot of different reasons that we'll talk about. So on the next slide, what I really see is the major problem is the quality of sex ed that young people receive. And I say kids, but I really mean middle school all the way through adulthood. So the quality of it is often poor. And there's just a tiny bit of it. It's too little of it. And this is where I like to make an Annie Hall joke. And then I make a joke too about making a Woody Allen comment, during a sex ed talk. But, he's got the joke from Annie Hall about the food's terrible and the portions are so small. And that's basically how sex ed is in America. It tends to not adequately cover all the topics that need to be covered. And it's not done well. And in particular, as we'll talk about in a minute, for autistic people, it's not done well. So what happens when somebody doesn't get adequate sex ed? They try to fill in the holes for themselves. Now, typically developing people might have a large peer group and learn from their friends, maybe interact with their older siblings and learn something there. But people who are having a lot of social interactions are going to absorb this information if they learn incidentally like that. People whose learning style is more explicit, they need to be explicitly taught. People who don't have a lot of relationships are not getting this information as easily and completely. So for autistic people, it can be a lot harder to informally get sex education. I always like to give the example, a peer of mine, a colleague who does very similar work, had a patient who texted to a girl he liked, and he just texted the word boobs and a question mark. He understood that, sending naked photos was something that some teenagers did. He knew he wanted to see this person's breasts, so that's what he did. What I always think about in that situation is if you had a couple of good friends around you, a couple of good buddies you were talking to, and you explained that you really like this girl and you wanted to talk to her, they would talk you down from that kind of text. They wouldn't let you do that kind of thing. And so I think that story is a really good illustration of how important the informal sexuality education is because that's often how we learn about social norms, and we learn when to put the brakes on ourselves and how to conduct ourselves in those interactions. And as I mentioned, the other big source of information is the internet. A big problem that I worry about with this is how much information people can access and at what a young age. So a lot of people will cite a statistic that says the average age of viewing pornography for the first time is 11. Other studies now have said even younger. So you see different numbers out there, but the point is kids are able to access that kind of imagery before they have a way to make sense of it and before they have better, more realistic sex ed information, to kind of consider along with it. So the next slide. This is an image that I like to use just to depict that perfect storm of autism plus the internet for sex ed. So you've got isolation. So often an autistic person might be on their own with their computer because they may have less to do. They might not be engaged in other activities. On the internet, you have exposure to some really toxic ideas. Certainly, you've got the whole incel movement and some misogyny, but there's a lot of bad ideas that people can develop from just reading online information. What I call stickiness here is really just a tendency to get stuck on particular topics, to get really interested in something and just do a deep dive. We know that that's a trait that often comes up in autism, areas of preoccupation. So getting really stuck on something can be a problem. If the thing you're stuck on is pornography, it can get blown out of proportion, right? Limited poor sex ed, I think we've talked enough about. There are some studies that show that autistic people spend more time online. And who knows what they're going to find after this whole pandemic, but pre-pandemic studies showed that autistic people were spending more time online. So having a lot of time online, getting stuck on a topic, doing this deep dive, being isolated, all of these things can come together and I think create conditions under which unhealthy ideas about sexuality and relationships can develop. So I think we've covered most of this. So what I wanted to do is kind of give you a couple of more specific examples of what happens when people get their sex ed from media, not just the internet, but I'm going to talk now about movies. So on the next slide, which is the slide I call Stalker Training, I want all of you to look at these pictures here. They're all movies. I'm sure you recognize many of these movies. In each of these movies, particularly the Disney movies, those are ones I've had a lot of patients be stuck on, but all of these were popular movies of their time. But all of these include male main characters who do something that would be pretty gross in real life. And someone like the Beast, for example, frankly, illegal in real life, right? So if you think about someone who isn't receiving adequate relationship training, someone who is very motivated by video and really likes watching movies, and this is the only way that they're learning about relationships, it's problematic. They're not learning appropriate boundaries and taking no for an answer, right? And just to give you a couple examples in case you weren't remembering what happened in some of these movies, in 10 Things I Hate About You, which is the one next to Aladdin, this character hires someone to date his girlfriend's sister to get more information. Pretty shady. And there's something about Mary. He hires a private investigator to track down his high school girlfriend. Aladdin only saw Jasmine once and fell in love and just told lie after lie after lie to try to woo her, and so forth. So you get the point. I'm not saying those movies shouldn't exist. I'm not saying they're a problem. But I am saying if you watch a movie like that with someone who has a social disability, or even someone who doesn't, someone who's still developing and learning about relationships, it's important to talk about the differences between what they saw and what real life is really like. The next slide. I think I've hit a lot of this, but just so you're aware, sex ed as it's provided in school tends to fail autistic students. Typically, the curriculum that's used wasn't designed for the social needs of people on the spectrum. And often it doesn't include the kind of direct explanation that's needed. There are usually a lot of euphemisms. My favorite illustration of the euphemisms that are used in sex ed is my own memory of getting sex ed in 5th grade. And the boys and the girls were separated. And then when we came back together at recess, we asked the boys like, oh, what did you hear? What did you find out? And all they could explain to us is, well, a girl's like a catcher's mitt and a boy's like a baseball. And that made no sense to us as a typically developing group of kids. I can't imagine if you're someone who already has trouble with non-literal language, how were you going to piece that together? But you get this a lot in sex ed. You get people like hinting at things or saying, do it. And if you don't make your language clear and direct and you're not comfortable in what you're talking about, you're probably not doing an adequate job for the person who needs that information. A lot of times sex ed assumes prior knowledge, and you really can't do that because a lot of prior knowledge is obtained socially, or it's obtained from watching movies and things, and you're picking up information, you're inferencing in ways that might not happen for an autistic person. I've evaluated or worked with plenty of guys in high school who are average intelligence, who did not understand some of the basics of how babies are made. So you just can't assume that those building blocks of prior knowledge are there. Or there may be misinformation that's just never gotten corrected. I'm sure you can all remember either you or a friend as you were growing up who just had some piece of information that wasn't right. And there's a lot of that when you're young and you're trying to learn about sex ed. And if you don't say it to a friend who corrects you, or your parents don't correct you, or it doesn't come up in some way, you might just keep believing that. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. I think we've hit most of this, but the one thing I want to point out is how important positive autistic identity is. Identity can be really hard to establish in autism. It can be very hard to know who you are and what's important to you. And understanding your autism and feeling really positive about it is crucial. And that can help you better understand your gender identity. It can help you better understand your sexual orientation. It can be a really good way to get to know yourself. So I just wanted to kind of point that out and make sure that I underscore that bit. On the next slide, I also, something else, like another little public service announcement I want to put out there. A lot of parents still are uncomfortable with gender diverse or sexual orientation diverse identities. And I want to make it really clear that there's already an increased suicide risk in autism. There's also an increased suicide risk for queer community and trans communities, especially trans. And so if your child is struggling or figuring out any of this, really important to let them know they belong in the family. They're not a burden. Those are two huge risk factors for suicide, feeling like you don't belong somewhere and feeling like a burden. So I want to make that suicide risk point, because I think if we're talking about gender identity, we're talking about sexual orientation, really important that all caregivers understand that there's a very real suicide risk, and that it's important to be accepting and make people feel like they have that belonging in the family, and also in other communities. The next slide is about the domains to cover in sex ed. And there are a few that are really important. And some of these are just typically handled pretty well. So if it comes to like human development, you know that reproduction and puberty are going to be handled really well. schools typically cover that stuff, no problem, right? It's the other aspects, development of identity, that typically isn't covered, but that's a really important part of human development. For relationships, it's important to talk about families, friendships, romantic relationships, dating. What do these things look like? Personal skills includes things like communication, negotiation, decision making. How do you navigate a lot of the situations that come up if you're dating? Sexual behavior includes a lot of different stuff. It includes abstinence, it includes partner, unpartnered sex, it includes what does sex look like in different configurations, sexual health. This is also one that's usually covered pretty thoroughly and pretty well in terms of sexually transmitted infections, contraception, pregnancy, those things are typically covered pretty well. But then society and culture is one that's often dropped completely. This includes things like gender roles, diversity, sexuality in the media. And that's a really important one, as we already talked about with my stalking slide. But being able to understand depictions of sex that you see in the media and how to interpret those. What I think is really interesting about this list I just read off to you, it's from a general sex ed resource. It's not an autism specific one. So even for a general population, there's so much of an emphasis on the social aspects. So that's crucial. Sex and intimate relationships, it's one of the most complicated social interactions. So it makes sense that we have to do an extra level of teaching and explanation for people who struggle with understanding social relationships. The next slide is a pretty general one about what to teach. So facts, right? The basics. And like I said, this is one that usually is covered and usually covered pretty well. It's the social aspects that often get missed. So the what to do, what not to do, and why it matters. Why? Because it's illegal. Why? Because people won't like it. Why? Because people will like it. It'll get you more dates. Whatever it is, explaining that why is a step that often gets missed. It's important that information is clear and concrete, factual. And I understand that with parents, it's harder to be non-judgmental because you'll have your own ideas, but certainly when sex ed's provided in a school setting or in a therapy setting, it's important, to not have that judgmental standpoint. The themes to hit on, so the next slide covers the different themes to teach in sex ed. Safety, and this includes protecting oneself, and good touch, bad touch in a really young kid is an important talk, all the way up to navigating consent and things like that as kids get older. Responsibility. I think this is a really important one that often gets dropped too. What are you ready for? You're responsible for the other person's feelings and experiences to an extent, right? As well as your own and how you feel later. Diversity. There's phenomenal diversity in sexuality. There's phenomenal diversity in what people want in relationships, even aside from sex. And so I think that's a piece that often gets missed, is just understanding the breadth of different relationships that happen. And pleasure. A lot of times the focus is on look out, don't get pregnant, look out, don't get an infection. And sometimes kids aren't taught and young people aren't taught that sex should feel good. And if it doesn't feel good, don't do it or do it differently. And that can be really important, especially for young women to learn, because they're sometimes pressured into relationships or they think they're not entitled to also enjoy themselves. The next slide is about adapting. So there are now a lot of specialized curricula. It's really changed. The problem historically has been the people who know autism are in one camp and the people who know sex ed are in a different camp. It's getting better. So now you can find some more autism specific materials and things, but still a little tricky. And so what that means is you're probably going to have to adapt and individualize what you're using. Because even if you use a book written for people with autism to teach them about sex ed, the needs of the person you're working with, the needs of the person you are, might differ from how it's written. And likely it will, because everybody's different. The next slide, I'm pretty specific in talking to parents here. Except the first point. The first point is I have a lot of therapists and doctors and other people I give this talk or similar talks to ask, how can they reach parents who don't want their kids to know about sex or don't want to have these talks with the kids? And what I always say is I think it's really important to stress safety. So not only do you want your young person to be able to keep themselves from being in dangerous situations, but maybe even from saying things that could get them in trouble, saying things that could be embarrassing. I often tell the story of a therapy patient I had years ago who was in high school, and her peers came up to her and they said, go ask Sally if she wants a blowjob. So she did it, and she ended up getting in trouble and also getting really embarrassed because someone else then said, well, you don't give blowjobs to a girl. It was a mess. And when she got to my office, I said, what do you think that means? What does it even mean? And she really had no idea. She thought it was if you blow in someone's face and their hair kind of goes up, their bangs go back. It was silly. But that's technically, like, that's putting her in an unsafe position. Having someone who's in high school and doesn't know some common sexual terms, it's pretty unsafe. You know, what if she were approached by somebody asking her that, or she used that language with someone and it turned out really badly? So anyway, stressing safety, but also stressing quality of life. Without these skills, without relationship development skills, without understanding of sexuality, it's really going to have a negative impact on quality of life. And then speaking to parents, but also to therapists and others who work with kids, I think it's really important to consider the child's communication style. Some children I call open books. You ask them a question and you will get a very frank answer. If you know people with autism, you likely know some people like this. They are not embarrassed, they are direct. There are other people and other autistic people who are very private, very embarrassed. So for those people, you might want to have a different approach. I think it's helpful to make a lot of materials available. So having good books on sex ed just available, bookmarking websites that have good sex ed information. So especially for those more private and embarrassed types, making sure that that information can be accessed even if they're not comfortable talking to a person about it. Sometimes it's helpful to have other adults available who the child can talk to. They might be embarrassed talking to dad, but they're really comfortable talking to an aunt about these things. And that's good, that's fine. Parent controls. So you heard some of my concerns about early exposure to pornography or exposure to pornography without lots of balancing information. I think it's important for there to be parent controls, especially for younger kids, and that they get gradually removed so that the kid can become more independent and the scaffolding is removed over time. And finally, it might be important to check with the school about having a sex ed goal. It depends on the student, it depends on the student's needs. But I think teaching about relationships in particular can be a really good transition goal. The next slide, teaching visually. This is just, I'm barely scratching the surface because we're limited on time, but there are a lot of adaptations that can be made if you're working with someone or you are someone who maybe doesn't speak or needs a lot of visual accommodations to understand the information. So this book you see up there called Teaching Children with Down Syndrome, I use it all the time for people who don't have Down syndrome. It has some really clear line drawings and graphics that explain things and talk about things. The language in it is fantastic. So if you have a learner who needs more support, this could be a really good resource. I have the circles on the other side. You see the concentric circles. This is just one example of visual supports that are used to teach about relationships. And many of you have probably seen something like this. But basically it's to help autistic people or anybody else understand levels of relationships that we have with people. So when I use something like this with my patients, we'll sometimes fill in the names at each level of, oh, who do you know who's a friend? Do you have an intimate partner? You know, we would fill these out. And then we would even get more specific and talk about, well, what kind of touch is okay in each of these circles? Would you be alone with somebody in each of these circles? What is it okay to talk about in each of these circles? So you can use this to make the information really concrete. The links down here, the Woodbine House link is where you can find the Down syndrome book, but also some other really good resources for learners who need more support. And the Stanfield website, they have the circles curriculum and they have other things there as well. The next slide, there are a whole lot of other resources here. There are just a couple I want to highlight. Scarlet Teen, which is the third one down. This is a website that is not autism specific, but it has a ton of sex ed information. If you were looking for a website to bookmark for a reader, maybe a really fluent reader who's an older teen, that would be a really good resource. It may be appropriate for a younger person as well, just depending upon their knowledge. But I would encourage you to check out a lot of these different resources. The Seattle Children's link, which is in the second column, the second one down, they have a really great resource that it lists a lot of sex ed things that are out there. So it sends you other places, but it's helpful. And then the last one to point out is the very last one on the list. So the kingwood.org. This is a UK-based organization that has some great videos, sex ed videos and free resources. So I highly recommend that as well. I will go ahead and transition to some questions.